Standing in my parents' kitchen, clutching the foreclosure notice with trembling hands, I felt my world collapse around me. The official document stated that their house would be seized in 30 days unless they paid $68,000 in overdue mortgage payments. My mother, Nancy, sobbed uncontrollably at the breakfast table, while my father, Robert, glared at me with pure hatred in his eyes. "This is all your fault, Aline," he spat. "Your brother Jake needed $50,000 to save his life, and you called him a liar. Now we're losing everything because we had to mortgage our home to pay his debts. You're heartless and stingy, and I'm ashamed to call you my daughter." 3 years earlier, I had been living my best life as a successful marketing director at a prestigious advertising firm in downtown Chicago. At 28 years old, I had worked incredibly hard to build my career, often staying at the office until midnight to perfect client presentations and develop innovative campaign strategies. My apartment in Lincoln Park reflected my dedication and success, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan and carefully chosen furniture that spoke to my professional accomplishments. That's when Jake called me, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine desperation. My younger brother had just gone through a bitter divorce from his wife, Maria, and according to him, she had cleaned out their joint bank account before filing papers. He explained that he was sleeping on a friend's couch with nowhere to go and no money for basic necessities. "Aline, I'm completely broke," he said during that late-night phone call. "Maria took everything, even the money I saved for starting my landscaping business. I have interviews lined up with potential clients, but I need a place to live first. Can you help me get back on my feet just for the first month until I start earning money?" My heart went out to him immediately. Jake had always been the charming one in our family, the brother who could make anyone laugh and had dreams bigger than our small hometown could contain. Growing up, he had worked extra shifts at our father's auto repair shop to help pay for my college textbooks when our family struggled financially. The memory of his sacrifice made my decision easy. "Of course I'll help you," I told him without hesitation. "Family takes care of family." Within 2 days, I had transferred $1,500 to cover his first month's rent for a studio apartment in Oak Park. Jake sounded incredibly grateful when he called to confirm he had signed the lease. He promised to pay me back as soon as his landscaping business started generating income. A week later, Jake invited me to lunch at a small diner near his new place to show me his progress. He arrived carrying a folder filled with what appeared to be business cards, customer estimates, and photographs of completed landscaping projects. The cards looked professional, featuring green and brown colors, with his name printed in bold letters, Jake Morrison Landscaping Services. "I already have 3 potential clients interested in spring cleanup work," he explained enthusiastically, spreading the materials across our table. "Mrs. Henderson from Elmwood Park wants her entire backyard redesigned, and there's a small office complex in River Forest that needs weekly maintenance starting next month." Jake had even purchased a used pickup truck, which he pointed out to me through the diner's window. The vehicle looked reliable and appropriate for his new venture, with ladder racks attached to the bed and magnetic business signs on both doors. I felt proud watching my brother take concrete steps toward rebuilding his life. His confidence seemed genuine, and his business plan appeared well thought out and practical. When I introduced him to several potential clients from my professional network, including the building manager at my office complex and neighbors in my apartment building who had mentioned needing yard work, Jake impressed them with his knowledge of plants, irrigation systems, and seasonal maintenance schedules. "Your brother really knows his stuff," my neighbor Mrs. Patterson told me after meeting with Jake about her garden renovation. He gave me a detailed estimate and timeline that shows he's serious about quality work. However, what I didn't know at the time was that Jake had discovered online poker during his first week in the new apartment. The $1,500 I gave him for rent had actually been used as seed money for his gambling activities. During his very first online session, Jake had won over $4,000 playing Texas Hold'em and the rush of that victory had convinced him that he had found his true calling. Instead of landscaping equipment and business supplies, Jake spent his days studying poker strategy videos and participating in increasingly high-stakes games. The business cards were printed at a local copy shop for $25, and the photographs of landscaping projects were images he had downloaded from Pinterest and various landscaping company websites. The truck was real, but Jake had borrowed it from his friend Carlos, who owned a small moving company. Carlos had agreed to let Jake use the vehicle for a few weeks in exchange for helping with furniture deliveries on weekends. The magnetic business signs were temporary decorations that Jake removed each time he returned the truck to Carlos. When I called Jake that evening to congratulate him on his promising start, he was in the middle of a particularly intense poker game, having just won another $2,000. The excitement in his voice that I interpreted as enthusiasm for his landscaping business was actually the adrenaline rush of gambling success. "This is just the beginning, Aline," he told me, watching his chip count increase on the computer screen. "I can already see this business changing my entire life." 6 months after Jake's fresh start, our regular phone conversations had become increasingly concerning, though I couldn't quite identify why. He would call me at odd hours, sometimes as late as 11 o'clock at night or as early as 5:30 in the morning, claiming he had just finished working on a landscaping project or was heading out to meet with potential clients. "The landscaping business is seasonal," Jake explained when I questioned his unusual schedule. "Early morning is the best time to water newly planted flowers, and I sometimes work into the evening during summer months when the heat isn't as intense." Despite his explanation, I noticed that Jake's financial requests had become more frequent and urgent. First, he needed $800 for an emergency security deposit when his landlord threatened eviction due to noise complaints from neighbors. Then, he required $1,200 to cover truck payments because his business account hadn't been properly set up to handle automatic withdrawals. "I'm so embarrassed about these temporary setbacks," Jake told me during one particularly emotional phone call. "The landscaping business takes time to build steady cash flow, especially when you're competing against established companies that have been around for years." I found myself regularly transferring money to cover his rent, groceries, and various business expenses that seemed to arise without warning. When Jake mentioned that he would be having his 2 young children, Emma and Tyler, stay with him during alternating weekends as part of his custody arrangement, I immediately offered to help with additional expenses. "Those kids are the most important thing in my life," Jake said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "I want to make sure they have everything they need when they're with me. Maybe you could help with some grocery money and weekend activity funds." I gladly provided an extra $300 every other week to ensure that Emma and Tyler would have enjoyable experiences during their visits with their father. Jake sent me photographs of the children at local parks, museums, and restaurants, and they always appeared happy and well cared for during their time together. It was during this period that Jake introduced me to his new girlfriend, Savannah. She was an attractive woman in her early 30s with long, auburn hair and an infectious smile that immediately put me at ease. Savannah seemed genuinely supportive of Jake's business aspirations and spoke knowledgeably about marketing strategies and customer service techniques. "Jake is incredibly talented," Savannah told me during our first meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Evanston. "He has such creative vision for outdoor spaces, and his attention to detail is remarkable. I've been helping him organize his business files and develop a more professional invoicing system." Savannah appeared to be a stabilizing influence in Jake's life. She had her own apartment and worked as a freelance graphic designer, which explained her interest in helping Jake improve his business presentation materials. When she offered to create a professional website for Jake's landscaping company at no charge, I felt relieved that my brother had found someone who believed in his potential and was willing to contribute to his success. "Having Savannah's support has made such a difference," Jake told me. She understands the challenges of running a small business, and she's been incredibly patient during this building phase. However, during one of my visits to Jake's apartment, I accidentally glimpsed his cell phone screen when a text message notification appeared. The banking app showed a balance of $31,457, which seemed surprisingly high for someone who had been requesting financial assistance for basic living expenses. When I mentioned what I had seen, Jake quickly grabbed his phone and explained that the money was tied up in equipment investments and business licenses that couldn't be accessed immediately. That balance represents payments I've received from clients, but the money is earmarked for specific business expenses, he said, speaking more rapidly than usual. I have to purchase commercial-grade lawnmowers, a trailer for equipment transport, and liability insurance before I can actually use those funds for personal expenses. Jake showed me printed estimates from equipment dealers and insurance companies that seemed to justify the frozen assets explanation. The numbers added up mathematically, and his reasoning appeared logical from a business development perspective. What I didn't realize was that the $31,000 represented Jake's recent winning streak in online poker tournaments. He had been participating in increasingly high-stakes games and had developed enough skill to consistently earn money from other players. However, Jake viewed this balance as gambling capital rather than personal income, and he reinvested most of his winnings into even larger tournaments with the goal of reaching six-figure payouts. Savannah's role in Jake's life was more complicated than I understood at the time. While she was indeed a freelance graphic designer, her primary income came from professional poker playing at casinos throughout the Chicago area and online platforms. Savannah had met Jake at a casino in Des Plaines, where she noticed his natural talent for reading other players and making strategic decisions under pressure. Rather than discouraging his gambling activities, Savannah had been teaching Jake advanced poker techniques and encouraging him to view his gambling as a legitimate career path. The website she created for his landscaping business was actually a front designed to provide a cover story for his gambling income, complete with fake client testimonials and project galleries assembled from stock photography. Jake has incredible potential. Savannah had told her own friends about their relationship. With the right guidance and some initial capital, he could easily make six figures a year playing professionally. The photographs of Emma and Tyler that Jake sent me were real, but their weekend activities were funded by his gambling winnings rather than the money I provided for childcare expenses. Jake had been using my financial contributions to cover his basic living costs while dedicating his poker earnings exclusively to higher stakes games that he believed would eventually make him wealthy enough to stop asking his family for help. When Jake called me late at night with excitement in his voice, he was usually celebrating a successful tournament victory or a particularly profitable evening at the casino. The energy I interpreted as passion for landscaping was actually the euphoria of gambling success combined with the confidence that came from consistent winnings. I can feel everything starting to come together, Jake told me during one of these late-night calls, having just won $4,800 in a tournament that had lasted until 3 o'clock in the morning. All the hard work and patience is finally starting to pay off in ways I never imagined possible. As autumn approached, Jake's requests for financial assistance had evolved into increasingly elaborate emergencies that required immediate attention and substantial amounts of money. The explanations became more detailed and urgent, often involving legal issues or business complications that I couldn't easily verify, but sounded plausible enough to motivate my continued support. "Aline, I need your help with something really serious," Jake said during a frantic phone call on a Tuesday morning while I was preparing for an important client presentation. The state licensing board is requiring all landscaping contractors to carry additional liability insurance, and I have to pay the premium immediately, or they'll suspend my business license. The urgency in his voice convinced me to leave my office during lunch to meet him at a bank branch near his apartment. Jake arrived carrying what appeared to be official documentation from the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, along with insurance quotes from legitimate companies that I recognized from television advertisements. "I've been trying to handle this myself for weeks," he explained, spreading the papers across a small table in the bank's customer waiting area. "But the insurance companies require payment in full before they'll issue the policy, and I can't access my business account funds without triggering penalties for early withdrawal." The insurance premium totaled $2,700, which would completely drain my checking account and force me to use my credit card for rent and groceries for the remainder of the month. However, Jake's business license suspension would mean losing all of his existing clients and having to start over completely, which would set back his progress by months or potentially years. "I promise this is the last time I'll need to ask for emergency help," Jake said, his eyes filled with what appeared to be genuine shame and desperation. "Once I get through this licensing issue, my business will be completely legitimate and profitable." I transferred the money that afternoon, sacrificing my weekend plans and several upcoming social activities to accommodate the unexpected expense. Jake seemed incredibly grateful and promised to prioritize paying me back as soon as his next client payments arrived. However, my concerns began to intensify when I decided to visit the business address listed on Jake's insurance paperwork and business cards. The location turned out to be a small strip mall in Berwyn, where the specified suite number led me to a mail forwarding service rather than an actual office or equipment storage facility. The elderly woman behind the counter confirmed that Jake Morrison had rented a mailbox for 6 months and received regular deliveries, but she had never seen him conducting any landscaping business or storing equipment on the premises. "The young man usually picks up his mail in the evenings," she told me. "He's always very polite, but I assumed he was using the address for personal mail rather than business purposes." When I confronted Jake about the discrepancy, he immediately became defensive and emotional, explaining that he used the mail service to maintain customer confidentiality and project his business as more established than it actually was. "Clients expect landscaping contractors to have professional business addresses rather than residential apartments," he said. "Using a mail service makes my company appear more legitimate and helps me compete against larger firms that have actual office spaces." However, before I could process this explanation completely, Jake's demeanor shifted to something much more vulnerable and desperate. He broke down crying and confessed that he was facing a family crisis that was far more serious than business licensing issues. "Maria has been threatening to take Emma and Tyler away from me permanently," he said through tears. "She's claiming that I'm an unfit father because I don't have stable income, and she's hired a lawyer to modify our custody agreement." Jake showed me text messages from Maria that appeared to support his claims. She had written several harsh messages questioning his ability to provide for their children and mentioning legal action to restrict his visitation rights. "If I lose my kids, I don't know what I'll do," Jake continued. "They're the only good thing left in my life, and Maria knows exactly how to hurt me. She's using the children as weapons because she's still angry about our divorce." The custody battle explanation made perfect sense to me and explained why Jake had been under such tremendous stress. As someone who had grown up in a stable, loving family, I couldn't imagine the pain of potentially losing access to my own children due to financial struggles. "How much do you need for legal fees?" I asked immediately already, mentally calculating which of my savings accounts I could access most quickly. "My lawyer requires a $5,000 retainer to begin building a strong custody case," Jake replied. "He specializes in fathers' rights cases and has a really good track record of helping men maintain meaningful relationships with their children." I agreed to help without hesitation, viewing the legal fees as an investment in my nephew and niece's well-being, rather than simply another financial request from Jake. That evening, I transferred the money and felt genuinely proud of supporting my brother during such a difficult time. However, 2 days later, I received a phone call that shattered my understanding of the entire situation. Maria, Jake's ex-wife, called me directly after getting my number from Jake's emergency contact information at Emma and Tyler's school. Aline? I'm confused about something, Maria said in a calm, friendly voice that immediately put me on edge. Jake told the kids that you've been helping him pay for legal fees to fight me in court, but I haven't received any paperwork from a lawyer, and I never threatened to take the children away from him. Maria explained that their custody arrangement was working smoothly, with Jake seeing the children every other weekend and one evening per week, as originally agreed upon in their divorce decree. She had never hired a lawyer or mentioned modifying their arrangement, and she was actually concerned about Jake because he had seemed stressed and distracted during recent child exchanges. Jake is a good father when he's present and focused, Maria continued, but lately he's been canceling visits at the last minute and forgetting important things like school events and doctor appointments. I'm worried something is wrong, but I would never use the children to punish him. The text messages Jake had shown me were completely fabricated. Mariah had never sent threatening messages about custody, and she was genuinely surprised to learn that Jake had been claiming otherwise. She offered to forward me their actual text message conversations, which consisted of routine scheduling discussions and updates about the children's activities. If Jake needs help, I'm willing to work with him, Maria said, but I don't understand why he would lie about me threatening him. That's not something I would ever do to the father of my children. After ending the call with Maria, I sat in my apartment staring out at Lake Michigan, trying to process the implications of what I had learned. The insurance licensing crisis, the business address discrepancy, and now the custody battle lies all pointed to a pattern of deception that I had been completely blind to despite mounting evidence. The realization that I had been manipulated so thoroughly made me feel naive and gullible, but it also sparked a determination to uncover the truth about what Jake was actually doing with the money I had been providing. The following Saturday morning, I drove directly to Jake's apartment without calling ahead, determined to demand honest answers about the lies Maria had exposed. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I rehearsed the conversation in my mind, trying to prepare for what I might discover about my brother's actual circumstances. Jake answered the door looking disheveled and surprised, wearing wrinkled clothes that suggested he had slept in them. His apartment, which I had only visited briefly during previous meetings, appeared cluttered with empty food containers, energy drink cans, and stacks of papers scattered across every available surface. "Aline, what are you doing here?" he asked, running his hands through his unwashed hair. "I wasn't expecting you today." "We need to talk about Maria," I said firmly, pushing past him into the living room. "I know you lied about the custody battle, and I want to understand why you've been deceiving me about everything." Jake's face immediately flushed red, and he began pacing nervously around the small room. For several minutes, he attempted to maintain his story about Maria's threats, but when I mentioned that she had called me directly, his entire demeanor collapsed. "Oh, okay," he said, sinking into a worn armchair and burying his face in his hands. "You're right. I lied about Maria threatening me, but I only did it because I was desperate and didn't know how else to ask for help." Jake looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, and for the first time in months, his emotional display seemed completely genuine rather than manipulative. "I have a gambling problem," he confessed quietly. "It started small with online poker, just a way to pass time while I was figuring out what to do with my life after the divorce. But then I started winning, and it felt like I had finally found something I was actually good at." The relief in his voice as he spoke the truth was palpable, and I found myself feeling both angry about the deception and sympathetic toward his obvious struggle with addiction. "The landscaping business was never real," Jake continued. I kept meaning to make it real, but every time I saved enough money to buy equipment or secure clients, I would see an opportunity in a poker tournament that seemed like a sure thing. I told myself I was just building capital to invest in the business properly. Jake explained that his gambling activities had become increasingly compulsive over the past year. What had started as recreational poker playing had evolved into 12-hour sessions that kept him awake for days at a time and consumed every dollar he could access. "I've lost everything I won and more," he admitted. "The money you've been giving me is the only thing that's kept me from being evicted and losing access to Emma and Tyler completely." Despite my anger about the lies, I felt genuinely moved by Jake's confession and his apparent desire to change his behavior. When he showed me brochures for gamblers, anonymous meetings, and a business card for a counselor who specialized in gambling addiction, I began to believe that he was serious about recovery. "I've already attended 3 meetings," Jake said, pulling out what appeared to be attendance verification sheets signed by group leaders. "The counselor says that admitting the problem to family members is a crucial step in the recovery process." Savannah arrived at the apartment while we were talking, and rather than being surprised by our serious conversation, she immediately expressed support for Jake's decision to seek help. "I've been encouraging Jake to be honest with you for weeks," she told me. "Hiding his gambling addiction has been eating him alive, and he needs family support to overcome this challenge." Savannah showed me printed materials about gambling addiction treatment and explained that she had been attending Al-Anon meetings to learn how to support someone in recovery without enabling their destructive behavior. "Recovery is a process, and Jake is going to need time and patience," she said. "But I believe he can overcome this if he has the right support system." Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to continue providing financial assistance for one final 3-month period while Jake transitioned away from gambling and began pursuing legitimate employment. We established a detailed repayment schedule and clear boundaries about how the money could be used. "This is absolutely the last time I'll ask for help," Jake promised, signing a written agreement that outlined his commitment to recovery and repayment. 3 months from now, I'll be completely self-sufficient and will start paying you back everything I owe." However, what I didn't know at the time was that Jake's confession represented only a partial truth designed to buy him additional time and financial support. While he did have a gambling problem, he hadn't actually attended any Gamblers Anonymous meetings or contacted a counselor about treatment. The attendance verification sheets were created by Savannah, who had researched local meeting schedules and forged group leader signatures. The counselor's business card was printed at the same copy shop where Jake had created his landscaping business materials. More significantly, Savannah's role in Jake's life was completely different from what she had represented to me. Rather than supporting his recovery from gambling addiction, she was actually his gambling partner and had been teaching him increasingly sophisticated techniques for professional poker playing. After I left that afternoon, I felt cautiously optimistic about Jake's prospects for recovery and proud of myself for providing appropriate support during a family crisis. I had no idea that within hours of my departure, Jake and Savannah would be celebrating their successful manipulation of my sympathy and planning how to use my continued financial support to bankroll their most ambitious gambling schemes yet. 2 weeks later, while helping Jake move some furniture from his storage unit to make space for exercise equipment he claimed was part of his recovery program, I discovered a cache of betting slips and casino receipts hidden inside an old couch cushion. The documents revealed gambling losses totaling over $80,000 during the previous 6 months, with individual bet amounts that far exceeded anything I could have imagined. The largest single loss was $14,000 on a poker tournament entry fee dated just 3 days after Jake had signed our recovery agreement and promised to stop gambling completely. As I stared at the evidence of Jake's continued deception, I realized that my brother's problems were far more severe than he had admitted. and that my well-intentioned support had been enabling a gambling addiction that was spiraling completely out of control. The discovery of the betting slips in Jake's couch cushion left me emotionally devastated and uncertain about how to proceed. After spending 2 sleepless nights analyzing the evidence and researching gambling addiction, I decided that our parents needed to understand the severity of Jake's condition and the extent to which he had been deceiving our entire family. Nancy and Robert had always been protective of Jake, viewing him as a more vulnerable child who needed extra support and understanding. Throughout our childhood, they had consistently made excuses for his impulsive behavior and had often asked me to be patient with his mistakes because that's just how Jake is. I arranged to meet them for Sunday dinner at their house in suburban Naperville, bringing copies of the betting slips and a folder of documentation that illustrated the scope of Jake's gambling losses. My intention was to present the evidence calmly and encourage them to join me in pursuing professional intervention for his addiction. However, before I could fully explain what I had discovered, Jake arrived unexpectedly with tears streaming down his face and immediately confessed his gambling problem to our parents in the most dramatic and manipulative presentation I had ever witnessed. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something that's going to break your hearts," Jake said, collapsing onto their living room sofa with theatrical despair. "I've been struggling with a gambling addiction and I'm finally ready to face the truth and get the help I need." Jake's confession was masterfully crafted to minimize the severity of his condition, while emphasizing his supposed commitment to recovery. He claimed that his gambling losses totaled only $15,000, and that he had been attending therapy sessions with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a counselor who specialized in addiction treatment. "Dr. Chen says that I have excellent potential for recovery because I'm young and motivated," Jake explained, showing our parents a professional-looking business card and treatment plan. "She's confident that with 3 more months of intensive therapy and family support, I can overcome this addiction completely." Nancy immediately began crying and embracing Jake, telling him how proud she was that he had found the courage to ask for help. Robert, though more reserved, expressed relief that Jake's recent financial struggles finally made sense and weren't the result of laziness or poor decision-making. "Addiction is a disease, not a character flaw," Nancy said, stroking Jake's hair while he continued his emotional performance. "We'll do whatever it takes to help you get better." When I attempted to show our parents the betting slips that revealed the true extent of Jake's losses, he immediately claimed that those documents represented his total gambling history over several years rather than recent activity. "I kept all of those receipts because Dr. Chen asked me to document every bet I had ever made," Jake explained. "It's part of the therapy process to understand the progression of my addiction. Most of those losses happened during my divorce when I was drinking heavily and making terrible decisions." Jake's explanation sounded reasonable to our parents, especially when combined with his apparent remorse and commitment to professional treatment. They had no experience with gambling addiction and trusted Jake's interpretation of the evidence I had presented. "The important thing is that Jake is getting help now," Robert said, putting his arm around his son's shoulders. "We can't change what happened in the past, but we can support his recovery moving forward." Our parents immediately began discussing how they could assist Jake during his recovery process. Nancy offered to attend therapy sessions with him to provide family support, and Robert suggested that Jake move back into their house temporarily to reduce his living expenses and eliminate financial stress that might trigger gambling urges. "Oh, family loyalty is the most important thing," Nancy told me when I expressed concerns about enabling Jake's behavior. "When someone we love is struggling with addiction, we don't abandon them. We stand by them and help them heal." The guilt-tripping intensified when our parents reminded me of how Jake had supported my college education by working extra shifts at Robert's auto repair shop. They emphasized that Jake had sacrificed his own opportunities to ensure that I could pursue my career goals without accumulating student loan debt. Jake worked 60 hours a week during your senior year so we could afford your textbooks and lab fees, Robert said. He never complained or asked for anything in return. Now he needs our help, and we have to be there for him the same way he was there for you. Jake reinforced this narrative by expressing gratitude for my previous financial support and apologizing for deceiving me about his circumstances. Aline has been incredible throughout this whole nightmare, he told our parents. I know I hurt her by lying, but she never gave up on me. I'm hoping she'll continue to support my recovery because I can't do this alone. Nancy looked at me expectantly, clearly hoping that I would agree to continue providing financial assistance during Jake's supposed treatment period. The emotional pressure in the room was overwhelming, and I found myself unable to articulate my growing suspicions about Jake's sincerity. Jake just needs 3 more months to complete his therapy program, Nancy pleaded. Dr. Chen says that family financial support during early recovery is crucial for preventing relapse. Against my instincts, I reluctantly agreed to provide limited assistance while Jake pursued treatment, but I insisted on establishing strict conditions and regular progress updates. Jake readily agreed to all of my requirements and promised complete transparency about his recovery activities. However, what I didn't realize was that Jake had been systematically stealing tools and equipment from Robert's auto repair shop for several months and selling them online to generate additional gambling funds. The theft had been carefully planned to avoid detection, with Jake taking only small items that wouldn't be missed immediately and selling them through anonymous online marketplaces. Jake had keys to the shop and frequently visited to help with bookkeeping or equipment maintenance, giving him unlimited access to valuable tools and parts. He had developed a sophisticated system for identifying items that could be resold quickly without raising suspicion, focusing on specialty tools that Robert used infrequently and might not notice were missing for weeks or months. The stolen merchandise had generated over $12,000 in additional gambling capital, which Jake had used to enter high-stakes poker tournaments that he believed would eventually make him wealthy enough to replace the stolen items before anyone discovered the theft. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the counselor whose business card Jake had shown our parents, was a real person who practiced in downtown Chicago. However, Jake had never contacted her or attended any therapy sessions. The business card had been obtained from the waiting room of a medical building where Jake had gone to meet a gambling contact, and the treatment plan was a document he had created using templates downloaded from addiction recovery websites. The therapy sessions that Jake claimed to be attending were actually extended gambling sessions at a casino in Indiana, where Savannah had secured them access to private high-roller rooms. Jake's emotional confession to our parents had been rehearsed extensively with Savannah's coaching designed to generate maximum sympathy while minimizing scrutiny of his actual activities. Your parents are incredibly caring people, Savannah had told Jake while helping him prepare for the confession. If you approach this correctly, they'll be so focused on supporting your recovery that they won't question the details of your story. Within days of gaining our parents' emotional support, Jake had resumed gambling with renewed intensity, using their sympathy as psychological cover for increasingly reckless behavior. The 3-month recovery timeline he had promised represented his estimate of how long he would need to win enough money to repay all his debts and create the illusion that his addiction treatment had been successful. 3 months should be enough time to hit a really big score, Jake had told Savannah. If I can win $50,000 or $60,000 in the right tournament, I can pay back Aline, replace everything I took from Dad's shop, and start over with a clean slate. The family meeting that I had intended as an intervention had instead become another opportunity for Jake to manipulate our emotions and secure additional resources for his gambling addiction, while our parents remained completely unaware that their unconditional support was enabling the very behavior they hoped to cure. 3 weeks after Jake's tearful confession to our parents, I began experiencing severe anxiety about the entire situation. Something about his recovery story felt fundamentally wrong, but I couldn't identify specific evidence to support my growing suspicions. The combination of wanting to believe in Jake's sincerity and feeling pressured by our parents' expectations had created an emotional conflict that was affecting my sleep and concentration at work. On a Wednesday evening, I decided to drive past the address where Jake claimed to be attending his therapy sessions with Dr. Elizabeth Chen. According to the schedule he had provided, his weekly group meeting was supposed to be taking place from 7 to 9 o'clock that night. The building was a modest medical complex in downtown Evanston, with well-lit parking areas and multiple entrances for different medical practices. I parked across the street where I could observe the main entrance without being noticed, feeling simultaneously guilty about spying on my brother and determined to verify his claims about treatment. At 8:15, I spotted Jake's borrowed truck pulling into the parking lot. However, instead of heading toward the medical building, Jake parked near a restaurant adjacent to the complex and waited in his vehicle for several minutes before driving away without entering any buildings. Confused and concerned, I decided to follow Jake at a distance to understand where he was actually going. The drive took us through several suburban neighborhoods before ending at the Empress Casino in Joliet, nearly 45 minutes from where his therapy session was supposed to be taking place. I watched from the parking garage as Jake entered the casino with obvious familiarity, greeting the valet attendants by name and walking directly toward the poker room without stopping to orient himself or check for directions. His confidence and comfort in the environment indicated that this was clearly not his first visit to the facility. My heart sank as I realized that Jake's recovery was completely fabricated, but I felt compelled to gather more evidence before confronting him again. I purchased a guest pass at the casino's front desk and spent the next 2 hours observing Jake from across the poker room. What I witnessed was both shocking and heartbreaking. Jake was participating in a high-stakes Texas Hold'em game with buy-ins of $1,500 per hand. The money he was wagering represented more than I had ever seen him handle, and his playing style demonstrated a level of skill and experience that could only have developed through extensive practice. During the time I watched, Jake lost over $4,000 with an emotional detachment that suggested this type of loss was a routine for him. When he ran out of chips, he calmly walked to an ATM machine and withdrew additional cash to continue playing, displaying none of the anxiety or remorse that should have accompanied such devastating financial losses. The most disturbing aspect of the evening was watching Jake interact with other players and casino staff. He was clearly a regular customer who had established relationships with dealers, servers, and security personnel. Several people greeted him warmly and asked about his recent runs and tournament results. "How did you do in Atlantic City last weekend?" one player asked Jake during a break between hands. "Not great," Jake replied casually. "Lost about $8,000, but I learned some valuable lessons that should pay off in future tournaments." The conversation revealed that Jake had been traveling to gambling destinations and participating in major tournament events activities that required significant financial resources and time commitments that contradicted everything he had told our family about his circumstances and recovery efforts. At 10:30, I watched Jake lose his final hand of the evening and leave the casino after losing approximately $6,000 in total. The money he had wagered that night represented more than twice the amount I had provided for his monthly living expenses, indicating that he had access to funding sources beyond my financial support. When I confronted Jake the following morning at his apartment, he was initially defensive and angry about what he characterized as surveillance and stalking behavior. "You had no right to follow me," he said aggressively. "What I do in my free time is my business, and you're starting to act like a controlling, paranoid person." However, when I described the specific details of what I had observed at the casino, Jake's hostility immediately transformed into panic and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, beginning to pace frantically around his living room. "I wasn't there to gamble recreationally. I was conducting research for my recovery program. Dr. Chen assigned me to observe gambling environments as part of exposure therapy to build resistance to temptation." Jake's explanation was so transparently false that I didn't even respond to it. Instead, I demanded to know where he had obtained the thousands of dollars he had lost that evening and how long he had been lying about attending therapy sessions. "The money came from a client who finally paid an overdue landscaping bill," Jake claimed initially. "I was using casino poker as a way to multiply that payment before investing it back into legitimate business activities." When I pointed out that his landscaping business had never actually existed, Jake abandoned that explanation and tried a different approach. "Well, okay, I've been playing poker professionally as a way to generate income during my recovery," he admitted. "It's a skill-based game that doesn't really count as gambling when you're good enough to consistently win money. I was planning to surprise you and Mom and Dad by paying back everything I owe from my tournament winnings." The conversation became increasingly surreal as Jake presented elaborate justifications for his behavior, each explanation more contradictory and desperate than the previous one. Finally, Savannah arrived and attempted to support Jake's latest version of events. "Jake has been making incredible progress in his recovery," she insisted. "Professional poker playing is completely different from compulsive gambling because it requires disciplined strategy and emotional control. He's actually using poker as therapy to rebuild his confidence and decision-making skills." Savannah claimed that she had been monitoring Jake's casino activities to ensure that he didn't relapse into compulsive gambling and that his recent losses were part of a learning process that would ultimately lead to consistent profits. "Recovery isn't linear," Savannah explained. "There are setbacks and challenges, but Jake's overall trajectory is positive. He's developing skills that will serve him well in legitimate business ventures." However, as Savannah spoke, I began to notice inconsistencies in her story that suggested she was far more involved in Jake's gambling activities than she had previously admitted. Her detailed knowledge of poker terminology, tournament structures, and casino operations indicated personal experience that extended beyond simply supporting Jake's supposed recovery efforts. "How do you know so much about professional poker if you're just helping Jake with his therapy?" I asked directly. Savannah hesitated before admitting that she occasionally played poker recreationally and had been teaching Jake advanced techniques to improve his chances of success. "I have some experience with the game," she said carefully. "I thought I could help Jake develop the skills he needs to be profitable rather than losing money to more experienced players." The admission that Savannah was actively teaching Jake gambling techniques while claiming to support his recovery from gambling addiction revealed the fundamental deception that had been underlying their entire relationship. Rather than helping Jake overcome his addiction, Savannah had been enabling and encouraging his gambling activities while helping him maintain the illusion of recovery for our family's benefit. As the truth about Jake's continued gambling and Savannah's role in enabling his behavior became clear, I realized that every aspect of his recovery story had been carefully constructed to manipulate my emotions and maintain access to financial support that was directly funding his gambling addiction. 2 months after discovering Jake's casino activities, I had stopped providing regular financial support and had begun distancing myself from his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain our previous arrangement. Jake's phone calls became more frequent and agitated as he realized that his access to family funding was ending, but I remained firm in my decision to stop enabling his gambling addiction. On a frigid February evening, I was settling into my apartment after a particularly demanding day at work when someone began pounding urgently on my front door. The knocking was so aggressive and persistent that I initially considered calling building security before recognizing Jake's voice calling my name through the hallway. When I opened the door, Jake appeared more desperate and disheveled than I had ever seen him. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, his hair was unwashed, and his hands were visibly shaking as he pushed past me into my living room without invitation. "Aline, I need your help immediately," he said, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm in serious trouble and I have 48 hours to fix this situation or something terrible is going to happen to Emma and Tyler." Jake explained that he owed $50,000 to people he characterized as dangerous individuals who had provided him with credit for high-stakes poker games. According to his story, these creditors had become increasingly aggressive about collecting their money and had begun making threats against his children. "They know where Emma and Tyler go to school," Jake said, showing me text messages on his phone that contained photographs of his children walking to their elementary school. "They sent these pictures to prove that they can reach the kids anytime they want. I have to pay them by Friday night or they're going to hurt my babies." The text messages were genuinely terrifying, featuring images of Emma and Tyler taken from various locations around their neighborhood and school, accompanied by messages that explicitly threatened violence against the children if Jake failed to repay his debts immediately. "Why don't you contact the police?" I asked, my voice trembling as I examined the threatening photographs. "These aren't the kind of people you involve law enforcement with," Jake replied. "They have connections and resources that would make police involvement more dangerous for everyone involved. The only solution is to pay them what I owe and hope they leave my family alone permanently." Jake showed me additional documentation that appeared to support his claims about the dangerous creditors. The materials included copies of gambling IOUs with official-looking signatures, photographs of expensive cars parked outside his apartment building, and printed emails containing increasingly threatening language about consequences for non-payment. "I've been trying to win the money back through legitimate tournament play," Jake explained, "but every time I get close to breaking even, I hit a bad streak that puts me even deeper in debt. These people don't care about my gambling addiction or my financial circumstances. They just want their money." The most compelling aspect of Jake's presentation was his obvious terror for his children's safety. His emotional distress appeared completely genuine, and the photographic evidence of surveillance around Emma and Tyler's school seemed to validate his claims about credible threats from dangerous individuals. Within an hour of Jake's arrival, I received a phone call from Nancy that intensified the emotional pressure surrounding the situation. "Aline, please help your brother," Nancy said through tears. "Jake told us about the people threatening Emma and Tyler. We can't let anything happen to those innocent children because of adult problems." Nancy explained that she and Robert had already contributed $8,000 from their retirement savings, but didn't have access to the full amount Jake needed to satisfy his creditors. "We're willing to mortgage our house if necessary," Nancy continued, "but that process will take weeks, and Jake says these people want their money by Friday. You're the only person in our family with enough liquid assets to save Emma and Tyler from these horrible people." The combination of Jake's genuine terror and our parents' willingness to risk their home to protect their grandchildren created overwhelming emotional pressure for me to provide the $50,000 immediately, despite my growing suspicions about Jake's honesty regarding other aspects of his gambling activities. "This is absolutely the last time I'll ever ask for financial help," Jake promised, signing a detailed promissory note that included specific repayment terms and legal consequences for default. "Once I pay off these creditors, I'm done with gambling forever. I'll get legitimate employment and pay you back every penny within 2 years." Jake's promissory note was notarized and included provisions for wage garnishment and asset seizure in the event of non-payment. The legal language appeared professionally drafted and gave me confidence that I would eventually recover my money even if Jake's gambling recovery efforts were unsuccessful. However, what I didn't know at the time was that the threatening text messages and surveillance photographs had been created by Carlos, Jake's friend, who owned the moving company. Carlos had been Jake's gambling partner for several months. and had agreed to help create a fake crisis that would motivate family members to provide the large sum of money Jake needed for his most ambitious gambling scheme yet. The photographs of Emma and Tyler had been taken by Carlos during routine surveillance of their neighborhood, but they were never in any actual danger. Carlos had used photo editing software to create the threatening text message conversations and had researched the intimidation tactics used by actual loan sharks to make the messages appear authentic. The expensive cars parked outside Jake's apartment building belonged to Carlos's moving company customers, and the gambling IOUs were documents that Jake had created using templates downloaded from legal document websites. The entire crisis had been manufactured to exploit my emotional attachment to Emma and Tyler's safety and overcome my rational concerns about continuing to enable Jake's gambling addiction. "Your sister really loves those kids," Carlos had observed while helping Jake plan the deception. "If she believes they're in danger, she'll do whatever it takes to protect them, even if she suspects you're lying about other things." Jake's plan was to use the $50,000 to enter a series of major poker tournaments in Las Vegas, where he believed his improved skills would allow him to win enough money to repay all his debts while establishing himself as a professional gambler. The promissory note was intended to buy him time to execute this plan before family members realized that no actual debt collection had taken place. 2 weeks in Vegas should be enough to either hit it big or lose everything, Jake had told Carlos. "If I win, I can come back and pay off everyone. If I lose, at least I'll have enough debt that bankruptcy will wipe out everything at once." The fake crisis had been designed not only to obtain money from me, but also to create a narrative that would explain Jake's disappearance from Chicago for several weeks, while he pursued his gambling activities in Nevada. As I agreed to provide the $50,000 to protect Emma and Tyler from what I believed were genuine threats, I was actually funding the most reckless and destructive phase of Jake's gambling addiction, while enabling him to continue deceiving our entire family about his true intentions and activities. The morning after agreeing to provide Jake with $50,000 to protect Emma and Tyler from supposed loan shark threats, I woke up with a profound sense of unease that I couldn't shake despite having made what seemed like the only possible decision given the circumstances. Something about the entire situation felt orchestrated and manipulative, but I struggled to identify specific evidence that would justify abandoning the children to potential danger. I spent my lunch break conducting online research about gambling-related debt collection and quickly discovered that legitimate loan sharks rarely target family members of debtors, especially young children. The threatening tactics Jake had described were more commonly associated with Hollywood movies than actual criminal behavior, which typically focused on seizing assets rather than endangering innocents. Additionally, the timeline Jake had presented didn't align with standard debt collection practices. Legitimate creditors, even dangerous ones, typically provided multiple warnings and opportunities for repayment before escalating to serious threats, while Jake claimed his situation had progressed from manageable debt to life-threatening crisis within a matter of days. These inconsistencies, combined with my growing understanding of Jake's pattern of deception, convinced me to reconsider my decision to provide the money. That evening, I called Jake to inform him that I needed additional verification of his claims before transferring such a large amount. "What kind of verification?" Jake asked, his voice immediately becoming defensive and agitated. "I want to speak directly with someone from the organization you owe money to," I replied. "If this situation is as serious as you claim, they should be willing to discuss payment arrangements with family members who are trying to help resolve the debt." Jake's response was immediate and explosive. He accused me of being paranoid, controlling, and fundamentally heartless for questioning the legitimacy of threats against his children. "You're willing to let Emma and Tyler get hurt because you're too selfish to trust your own brother," he screamed into the phone. "What kind of person demands proof when children's lives are at stake? You're supposed to be helping me, not investigating me like I'm a criminal." The conversation escalated quickly as Jake became increasingly abusive and manipulative, using language designed to guilt me into providing the money without further questions. "I can't believe you're my sister," he continued. "Emma and Tyler love you, and you're gonna let strangers hurt them because you care more about money than family. If something happens to those kids, their blood will be on your hands forever." However, instead of intimidating me into compliance, Jake's extreme reaction convinced me that my suspicions were justified. Someone who was genuinely concerned about their children's safety would welcome additional verification rather than becoming angry about reasonable precautions. "I'm not giving you $50,000 without proof that this situation is real," I said firmly. "If Emma and Tyler are actually in danger, we need to involve law enforcement regardless of your concerns about the creditor's connections." Jake's hostility intensified when he realized that I wouldn't be manipulated by emotional appeals or guilt tactics. "You've always been jealous of me," he said with genuine venom in his voice. "You can't stand that I'm talented at something you don't understand, and you're using this crisis as an excuse to control my life and make me suffer." The conversation ended with Jake hanging up on me after declaring that he would never forgive me if anything happened to his children because of my selfishness and paranoia. Within an hour, I received a call from Nancy that was even more emotionally manipulative than Jake's tirade. "Aline, what are you doing?" Nancy asked, her voice filled with disappointment and disbelief. "Jake told us that you're refusing to help protect Emma and Tyler. How can you be so cold and calculating when innocent children are involved?" Nancy's lecture about family loyalty and moral responsibility continued for nearly 30 minutes, with her repeatedly emphasizing that my financial success created an obligation to protect family members from dangerous situations. "You make more money than anyone else in our family," Nancy said. "It's not fair for you to hoard your wealth while your brother's children are threatened by criminals. This is exactly the kind of situation where family members are supposed to help each other without conditions or questions." Robert joined the conversation and was even more direct in his criticism of my decision to verify Jake's claims before providing money. "You're overthinking this situation," Robert said. "When family members are in trouble, you help first and ask questions later. Jake has never lied about anything involving Emma and Tyler, and you're being unnecessarily suspicious during a crisis." The emotional pressure from both parents was overwhelming, especially when they threatened to cut contact with me unless I agreed to help immediately. "If you abandon Jake and those children during this crisis, don't expect us to welcome you at family gatherings anymore," Nancy said. "We raised you to care about family more than money, and you're disappointing us in ways we never imagined possible." However, rather than capitulating to their emotional blackmail, I found myself becoming more determined to resist manipulation from every member of my family. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I replied firmly. "I'm asking for reasonable verification of a serious situation before providing a large sum of money. If Jake's story is true, proving it should be easy." The conversation ended with my parents expressing profound disappointment in my character and values, but I felt more confident in my decision than I had about any family-related choice in months. Later that evening, I discovered that Jake had been secretly recording our phone conversation about the supposed loan shark threats. Using basic audio editing software, he had removed portions of my responses to make me sound cold and heartless while preserving his emotional appeals about protecting Emma and Tyler. Jake had already shared the edited recording with multiple extended family members, including aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had no context for understanding our recent conflicts about his gambling addiction. The manipulated audio made it sound like I was refusing to help endangered children out of petty spite rather than legitimate concerns about being deceived. By the end of the week, I had received angry phone calls from relatives across the country, all of whom had been convinced by Jake's edited recording that I was a selfish and heartless person who cared more about money than family welfare. "I always thought you were the responsible one," My Aunt Patricia told me during one particularly hurtful conversation. But refusing to protect your own nephew and niece shows a side of your character that I never suspected existed. The realization that Jake had manipulated me into saying things that could be used against me, and that he had been planning this deception carefully enough to record our conversation, confirmed that every aspect of his supposed crisis had been fabricated to obtain money for continued gambling activities. 2 weeks after my decision to refuse Jake's request for $50,000, the family crisis that I had suspected was manufactured suddenly became devastatingly real, though not in the way anyone had anticipated. On a quiet Tuesday evening, while I was working late at my advertising firm, I received a frantic phone call from Nancy that immediately filled me with dread. "Aline, we need to talk immediately," Nancy said, her voice trembling with panic and shame. "Your father and I have been hiding something terrible, and we can't keep it secret anymore." She asked me to drive to their house in Naperville right away, explaining that they had received legal documents that required immediate family discussion. The urgency in Nancy's voice was unlike anything I had heard from her before, and I left my office immediately, despite having an important client presentation the following morning. When I arrived at my childhood home, I found both of my parents sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by official-looking papers and financial documents. Nancy had clearly been crying for hours, and Robert appeared older and more defeated than I had ever seen him. "But we're losing the house," Robert said without preamble, handing me a foreclosure notice dated 3 days earlier. "We have 30 days to pay $68,000 in overdue mortgage payments, or the bank will seize the property." I stared at the legal document in disbelief, trying to understand how my financially conservative parents could have fallen so far behind on their mortgage payments without anyone in the family knowing about their struggles. "How is this possible?" I asked. "You've owned this house for 25 years. I thought the mortgage was almost paid off." Nancy began crying again as Robert explained that they had secretly taken out a second mortgage 6 months earlier to pay off debts that Jake had accumulated through his gambling activities. "Jake came to us in August, claiming that dangerous people were going to hurt him if he didn't pay $50,000 immediately," Robert said. "He was shaking and crying, begging us to save his life. We couldn't let our son be murdered over gambling debts." My parents had used their house as collateral to secure a home equity loan, believing that Jake's promises to repay the money within 3 months were genuine. They had never mentioned the loan to me because they wanted to handle the crisis privately and protect Jake's reputation within the family. "Jake swore that he had learned his lesson and would never gamble again," Nancy explained through tears. "He said he just needed one final bailout to start over with a clean slate. We believed him because we're his parents and we love him." However, instead of using the $50,000 to pay off legitimate debts, Jake had used the money as capital for even higher stakes gambling activities. Within 2 months, he had lost the entire amount, along with additional money he had borrowed from other sources. When Jake couldn't repay us as promised, we started using credit cards to make the mortgage payments, Robert admitted. "We kept thinking he would come through eventually, but the situation just got worse every month." The financial documents spread across their kitchen table revealed the devastating extent of my parents' sacrifice on Jake's behalf. They had maxed out 4 different credit cards borrowed against Robert's retirement account and had been working extra hours to generate additional income that could be dedicated to mortgage payments. "We've been eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and canceling medical appointments to save money," Nancy said, "but it's not enough to keep up with the payments anymore." The most heartbreaking aspect of their confession was learning that they had been hiding their financial crisis for months while continuing to pressure me to provide additional support for Jake's supposed recovery efforts. "We couldn't tell you about the mortgage because we didn't want you to think we were irresponsible," Robert explained. "We kept hoping that Jake would start earning legitimate income and help us catch up on the payments." When I asked why they hadn't simply told Jake about their financial problems and asked him to get a regular job to help with expenses, Nancy's response revealed the depth of their denial about his gambling addiction. "We didn't want to put pressure on Jake during his recovery," she said. "Dr. Chen told us that financial stress could trigger a relapse, so we thought it was better to handle the mortgage problems ourselves until he was stronger." However, as the conversation continued, I learned details that made Jake's deception even more cruel and calculated. He had been aware of our parents' financial struggles for weeks and had actually encouraged them to keep their problems secret from me. "Jake said you would be angry with us for taking out the second mortgage," Robert explained. "He convinced us that telling you about our financial problems would create family conflict that might interfere with his therapy progress." Jake had been living comfortably in his apartment, spending money on restaurants and entertainment, while knowing that our parents were sacrificing their meals and medical care to pay for his gambling debts. He had even borrowed an additional $800 from Nancy the previous week, claiming he needed money for therapy copays. The revelation that Jake had been manipulating our parents' love and concern to protect himself from the consequences of his gambling addiction while they struggled to avoid losing their home filled me with a rage that I had never experienced before. "We're not telling you this to ask for money," Nancy said quickly when she saw my emotional reaction. "We just couldn't keep hiding the truth anymore. We wanted you to understand why we believed Jake's story about the dangerous creditors." However, as I examined the mortgage documents more carefully, I discovered something that made Jake's betrayal even more shocking. The address listed on several bank statements was an upscale apartment complex in downtown Chicago, suggesting that Jake had been living somewhere much more expensive than the modest place where I had been visiting him. "Do you know where Jake actually lives?" I asked my parents. "He's been staying with Savannah in Oak Park," Nancy replied. "He said they moved in together to save money during his recovery." That evening, I drove to the address listed on the bank statements and discovered that Jake had been living in a luxury apartment building with amenities that included a fitness center, rooftop pool, and concierge service. The monthly rent for his unit was $2,800, nearly twice what he had been claiming to pay for his supposedly modest accommodations. A brief conversation with the building's leasing office revealed that Jake had been a resident for 4 months and had always paid his rent on time, indicating that he had access to steady income sources that he had concealed from our family. The discovery that Jake had been living in luxury while our parents sacrificed their home and basic necessities to cover his gambling debts represented a level of selfishness and cruelty that I had never imagined possible from someone I had loved and supported unconditionally for my entire life. The following week brought a cascade of painful revelations as Jake's manipulated recording of our conversation about the supposed loan shark threats spread throughout our extended family network. I began receiving phone calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, each one expressing shock and disappointment at what they perceived as my heartless refusal to protect endangered children. My Aunt Patricia, who had always been my favorite relative growing up, left a voicemail that brought me to tears with its harsh condemnation of my character. Aline? I don't even know who you are anymore," Patricia's recorded voice said. "Jake played me the recording of you refusing to help save Emma and Tyler from dangerous criminals. I never thought my own niece could be so selfish and cold-hearted. Your grandmother would be ashamed if she knew how you've abandoned your family responsibilities." Similar messages arrived from my Uncle Thomas in Denver, my cousin Sarah in Phoenix, and my great-aunt Helen in Florida. Each relative had received the same edited audio file that made me sound like a monster who cared more about money than the safety of innocent children. The most devastating call came from my cousin David, who was a successful attorney in Minneapolis and had always been someone I respected for his intelligence and fairness. "Aline, I've listened to Jake's recording several times, and I have to say I'm concerned about your judgment," David said during a 20-minute conversation that left me questioning my own sanity. I understand that Jake has had problems with gambling, but refusing to protect children from violent criminals crosses a line that I never expected you would cross. David's legal expertise made his criticism particularly painful because I had hoped he would recognize the inconsistencies in Jake's story and support my decision to demand verification before providing money. Even if there's only a 10% chance that Jake's story is true, the potential consequences of being wrong are too serious to ignore. David continued. You should have provided the money immediately and sorted out the details later. When I tried to explain my concerns about Jake's pattern of deception and the suspicious aspects of his crisis story, David dismissed my arguments as paranoid speculation. You're overthinking this situation, he said. Jake may have lied about other things, but he would never fabricate threats against his own children. That's not something any parent would joke about or use for manipulation. The conversation with David was particularly frustrating because he refused to consider the possibility that Jake's entire crisis had been manufactured, despite my detailed explanations about the inconsistencies in his story and the unlikely nature of his claims about loan shark behavior. Jake had been strategic in his manipulation of family members, sharing different versions of his story with different relatives, and providing each person with just enough information to generate sympathy without revealing details that might raise questions about his credibility. To Patricia, Jake had emphasized my supposed jealousy of his poker skills and my desire to control his life. To Thomas, he had focused on my financial success and claimed I was hoarding wealth while family members suffered. To Sarah, he had played up his role as a struggling single father trying to protect his children from dangerous criminals. The most damaging aspect of Jake's campaign against me was his claim that I had always considered myself superior to the rest of the family and had been looking for an excuse to abandon my relatives when they needed help most. Aline has always thought she was better than everyone else because she went to college and has a fancy job. Jake had told several family members. She's been waiting for an opportunity to prove that she doesn't need her family anymore. This narrative resonated with relatives who had sometimes felt intimidated by my professional success and who had noticed that I lived a more affluent lifestyle than other family members. Jake's manipulation played into existing insecurities and resentments that I had never realized existed within our extended family. Within 2 weeks, I had been uninvited to my cousin Michael's wedding in Ohio and my great-aunt Helen's 80th birthday celebration in Florida. Family members who had previously included me in group text messages and social media conversations suddenly stopped responding to my messages and comments. The social isolation was emotionally devastating, especially because I couldn't defend myself without revealing details about Jake's gambling addiction that might damage his relationship with his children and create additional family conflicts. During this period of family ostracism, I received a concerning phone call from my cousin David that revealed Jake's manipulation had escalated beyond simply damaging my reputation. Aline, I need to give you a heads up about something, David said. Jake has been asking me about the legal process for filing emotional distress lawsuits against family members. He claims you've caused him severe psychological damage through your refusal to help during his crisis. David explained that Jake had been researching the possibility of suing me for intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming that my suspicious and controlling behavior had worsened his gambling addiction and created additional trauma for his children. I told Jake that emotional distress lawsuits between family members are rarely successful, David said, but he seems convinced that he has a strong case because of the recording he made of your conversation. The threat of legal action from Jake represented a new level of betrayal that I hadn't anticipated. Not only had he manipulated our family's emotions to obtain money for gambling, but he was now considering using the legal system to punish me for refusing to be deceived. Earl, Jake mentioned that he's been keeping detailed records of all your interactions, including dates, times, and amounts of money you've provided over the past 3 years. David continued. He claims he can prove a pattern of controlling behavior that has interfered with his recovery from addiction. However, what I didn't know at the time was that Jake's legal research was motivated by desperation rather than genuine grievance. His gambling losses had accelerated dramatically since my refusal to provide the $50,000, and he was exploring every possible option for obtaining money to continue his activities. Jake had also been spreading rumors among family members that I earned significantly more money than my actual salary, claiming that I was hiding assets and could easily afford to provide financial support, but chose not to out of spite and jealousy. Aline makes over $200,000 a year, Jake had told several relatives. She could give me $50,000 and barely notice the difference, but she's choosing to let Emma and Tyler suffer because she's angry about my gambling mistakes. This false information about my income created additional resentment among family members who began to view my refusal to help as evidence of extreme selfishness rather than reasonable caution about enabling destructive behavior. The most painful aspect of the family betrayal was learning that Jake had been portraying me as the villain, in a story where he was the sympathetic victim struggling to overcome addiction while protecting his children from dangerous criminals. His version of events made my concerns about his honesty appear to be cruel and unnecessary obstacles to his recovery and his children's safety. As the social isolation from my extended family continued, I began to understand that Jake's manipulation had been far more sophisticated and comprehensive than I had initially realized. He had been carefully constructing narratives and managing information for months, possibly years, to ensure that any attempt by me to expose his deception would be met with skepticism and hostility from other family members. The realization that I had been fighting a battle where my opponent controlled the information available to potential allies left me feeling more alone and vulnerable than I had ever experienced in my life. After enduring weeks of family ostracism and growing suspicious about the sophisticated nature of Jake's deception campaign, I made the difficult decision to hire a private investigator to document the truth about his activities and gather evidence that might protect me from his threatened lawsuit. The investigator, Margaret Torres, was a former police detective who specialized in cases involving financial fraud and family manipulation. Based on what you've described, your brother has been running a long-term con game that extends far beyond simple gambling addiction, Margaret told me during our initial consultation. The level of planning and coordination you've described suggests that multiple people are involved in maintaining these deceptions. Margaret's investigation began with surveillance of Jake's actual living situation and daily activities. Within 3 days, she had confirmed that Jake was indeed living in the luxury apartment building I had discovered, but her findings revealed additional deceptions that were far more extensive than I had imagined. Your brother has been running what appears to be a small-scale Ponzi scheme, Margaret reported during our first progress meeting. He's been soliciting investments from friends and acquaintances by claiming he has a foolproof gambling system that generates guaranteed returns. Margaret had documented meetings between Jake and at least 6 different individuals who had provided him with money based on promises of 30 to 40% returns on their investments within 60 days. Jake's pitch involved claiming that his mathematical background and poker skills allowed him to identify betting opportunities that were essentially risk-free. One investor, a man named Christopher Walsh, gave Jake $15,000 3 months ago after being shown fake bank statements that appeared to document previous successful investments, Margaret explained. Jake has been stringing Christopher along with small partial payments while using the principal to fund his own gambling activities. The investigation revealed that Savannah's role in Jake's schemes extended far beyond simply teaching him poker techniques. She was an experienced professional gambler who had been using her expertise to help Jake create convincing presentations for potential investors and maintain the illusion that his gambling activities were profitable rather than destructive. Savannah has been helping Jake manipulate his bank statements and create false documentation of gambling winnings, Margaret reported. She has access to sophisticated accounting software and has been producing reports that make Jake's losses appear to be investments in long-term gambling strategies. Margaret's surveillance also uncovered evidence that Jake had been stealing from our father's auto repair shop for nearly 8 months, taking tools and equipment that he sold through online marketplaces to generate additional gambling funds. Your brother has developed a systematic approach to the theft, Margaret explained, showing me photographs and receipts that documented Jake's criminal activities. He targets items that your father uses infrequently and sells them through multiple platforms to avoid detection. The total value of stolen merchandise appears to exceed $20,000. The most shocking discovery was that Jake had been accessing our elderly grandmother's bank account using emergency contact privileges that had been granted to him after our grandfather's death 2 years earlier. Margaret's financial investigation revealed that Jake had withdrawn over $18,000 from Grandma Rose's savings account over the course of 6 months. The withdrawals were structured to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, Margaret reported. Your brother has been taking amounts between $500 and $2,000 at irregular intervals, and he's been using ATM machines in different neighborhoods to make the transactions appear legitimate. Margaret's investigation of Savannah revealed that she had a criminal history involving check fraud and identity theft from her early 20s, though she had avoided conviction through plea agreements and community service. More significantly, Savannah was currently under investigation by the Illinois Gaming Board for suspected collusion with other players in several Chicago area poker tournaments. Savannah appears to be Jake's mentor in criminal activity rather than his girlfriend, Margaret explained. Their relationship is primarily professional, focused on maximizing gambling profits through both legal and illegal methods. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Jake had been planning to fake his own death to escape his mounting debts and avoid criminal prosecution for his theft activities. Margaret had discovered that Jake had recently purchased a life insurance policy with our parents listed as beneficiaries, and he had been researching methods for creating false identities and disappearing without detection. Your brother has been studying cases of successful disappearances and has been accumulating cash and fake identification documents, Margaret reported. There are indications that he was planning to stage some kind of accident or violent crime that would make his death appear legitimate, while allowing him to escape to another state with a new identity. Margaret's financial analysis revealed that Jake's gambling losses over the past 3 years totaled over $250,000, far exceeding the amount of money I had provided to support him. The gap between his losses and my financial contributions indicated that he had been obtaining money from multiple sources while using my support to maintain his basic living expenses. Your brother has been operating as a career criminal who specializes in exploiting family relationships and emotional manipulation, Margaret concluded. His gambling addiction may have been the initial motivation for his behavior, but his activities have evolved into a comprehensive fraud operation that targets multiple victims simultaneously. The evidence Margaret compiled included bank records, surveillance photographs, victim statements, and documentation of criminal activities that painted a picture of Jake as someone far more dangerous and calculating than I had ever imagined possible. Jobo, based on the evidence I've gathered, your brother poses a significant threat to your family's financial security and potentially their physical safety, Margaret warned. His escalating criminal behavior and his planning for disappearance suggest that he's prepared to abandon all family relationships to avoid accountability for his actions. Margaret recommended that I contact law enforcement immediately to report Jake's theft from our father's business and his unauthorized access to our grandmother's bank account, as these activities constituted felony crimes that could result in serious criminal charges. The longer you wait to report these crimes, the more damage your brother can inflict on your family, Margaret advised. His current trajectory suggests that he's planning something dramatic that will likely cause devastating financial and emotional harm to everyone who has trusted him. The private investigation had revealed that my refusal to provide $50,000 for Jake's supposed loan shark crisis had actually prevented me from funding what would have been his most ambitious and destructive gambling scheme, potentially saving me from financial ruin while exposing the true extent of his criminal activities. Armed with Margaret Torres's comprehensive investigation results, I faced the daunting task of presenting evidence to my family members who had been systematically turned against me by Jake's manipulation campaign. I knew that simply sharing the private investigator's findings would not be sufficient to overcome months of carefully constructed lies and emotional manipulation. My first step was to approach Maria Jake's ex-wife, who had been completely unaware of the extent of his criminal activities and their potential impact on Emma and Tyler's future. I arranged to meet Maria at a coffee shop near her workplace, bringing copies of the most compelling evidence from Margaret's investigation. "I need to show you something that's going to be very difficult to hear," I told Maria as we settled into a quiet corner booth. "Jake has been involved in criminal activities that could affect his custody rights and potentially put Emma and Tyler at risk." Maria's initial reaction was skepticism and defensiveness, as she had been receiving pressure from Jake to maintain distance from our family during what he characterized as our ongoing conflict about his recovery efforts. "Jake told me that you've been trying to control his life and interfere with his treatment for gambling addiction," Maria said carefully. "He seemed more stable lately, and the children enjoy their visits with him." However, as I presented the evidence of Jake's theft from our father's business, his unauthorized access to our grandmother's bank account, and his operation of a Ponzi scheme targeting friends and acquaintances, Maria's skepticism transformed into horror and genuine fear for her children's well-being. "He's been stealing from your own grandmother," Maria asked, staring at the bank records that documented Jake's systematic theft from Grandma Rose's savings account. "How could anyone do that to their own family?" Maria's perspective on recent interactions with Jake began to shift as she recognized patterns of behavior that suddenly made sense in light of the criminal evidence. Emma mentioned that Jake has been giving them expensive gifts lately, including video game systems and designer clothes that seemed beyond his budget, Maria said. "When I asked him about it, he claimed he was finally earning good money from his landscaping business." Mariah also revealed that Jake had been questioning Emma and Tyler about their daily routines, school schedules, and my involvement in their lives' conversations that had seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared potentially sinister. He asked Emma if Aunt Aline ever came to her school events or picked her up from activities, Maria recalled. "I thought he was just trying to stay informed about extended family relationships, but now I'm wondering if he was gathering information for some other purpose." The revelation that Jake had been researching the children's routines while planning his fake death scheme created genuine terror in Maria about his true intentions regarding Emma and Tyler's safety. "Do you think he would hurt the children?" Mariah asked, her voice trembling with fear. I don't know," I admitted honestly. "But someone who's willing to steal from his own grandmother and threaten to fake his death to avoid consequences is capable of making decisions that could endanger everyone around him." Maria immediately agreed to cooperate with documenting Jake's criminal activities and promised to restrict his access to the children until law enforcement could fully investigate his behavior. Emma and Tyler deserve to be protected from their father's criminal activities, Maria said firmly. I won't let them become victims of his selfishness and dishonesty. My next step was to present evidence to our parents, who I knew would be the most difficult family members to convince due to their emotional investment in protecting Jake and their own shame about the financial consequences of supporting his activities. I arranged to meet Nancy and Robert at their house on a Saturday afternoon, bringing comprehensive documentation of Jake's crimes and a carefully prepared presentation that anticipated their likely emotional reactions. Mom, Dad, I need to show you evidence that Jake has been lying to all of us about far more than just his gambling addiction. I began spreading Margaret's investigation results across their kitchen table. Nancy's initial response was immediate denial and anger at what she characterized as my continued persecution of Jake during his recovery efforts. I can't believe you hired a private investigator to spy on your own brother, Nancy said, refusing to look at the evidence I had arranged on the table. This is exactly the kind of controlling, paranoid behavior that Jake warned us about. However, when I showed them the bank records documenting Jake's theft from Grandma Rose's savings account, both parents became silent and began examining the evidence with genuine attention. Jake has been stealing from his own grandmother while she's been struggling to afford her medications, I explained gently. Grandma Rose has been skipping doses of her heart medication because she thought she couldn't afford to refill her prescriptions. The realization that Jake's theft had been directly endangering our 92-year-old grandmother's health created the first crack in Nancy's emotional defense of his behavior. But why would he steal from Grandma Rose when he knew we were helping him with money? Robert asked, genuinely confused about Jake's motivation for additional theft. Because our help wasn't enough to fund the level of gambling he was pursuing, I explained. Jake has been running a Ponzi scheme and stealing from multiple sources to generate the capital he needs for high-stakes poker tournaments and casino gambling. I presented evidence of Jake's investor fraud scheme, showing them copies of fake bank statements and investment reports that Jake had used to convince friends to provide him with money based on promises of guaranteed returns. Christopher Walsh gave Jake $15,000 3 months ago based on these fabricated documents. I explained, showing them the false investment materials. Jake has been using the money for gambling while providing Christopher with fake progress reports and small partial payments to maintain the deception. The evidence of systematic fraud targeting people outside our family helped Nancy and Robert understand that Jake's deceptions extended far beyond his relationship with our family and represented a pattern of criminal behavior rather than simply an addiction-related mistake. However, the most shocking revelation for our parents was learning about Jake's plan to fake his death to escape accountability for his crimes. Jake purchased a life insurance policy with you as beneficiaries and has been researching methods for creating false identities. I explained, showing them documentation of Jake's research into disappearance techniques and identity fraud. He was planning to abandon Emma and Tyler forever to avoid going to prison for his crimes. I continued, your son was willing to let his children believe their father was dead rather than face responsibility for stealing from his own family. The evidence of Jake's willingness to psychologically devastate his children to protect himself finally broke through Nancy's denial about the severity of his character flaws. I don't understand how Jake became this person, Nancy said, crying as she examined the insurance policy documentation. This isn't the son we raised. Something has gone terribly wrong with his judgment and his values. Robert's response was more focused on the practical implications of Jake's criminal activities for our family's immediate safety and financial security. If Jake has been stealing from my business and planning to disappear, we need to protect ourselves and report his crimes to the police, Robert said, his voice filled with resignation and disappointment. The presentation of evidence to our parents marked the beginning of our family's recognition that Jake represented a genuine threat to everyone who had trusted and supported him, and that protecting ourselves would require treating him as a dangerous criminal rather than a misguided relative struggling with addiction. With Maria's support and our parents' reluctant acknowledgement of the evidence against Jake, I knew that a final confrontation was inevitable. However, before I could organize a family meeting to address his criminal activities directly, Jake and Savannah made their own desperate move that accelerated the timeline for exposing their schemes to law enforcement. Margaret Torres called me on a Wednesday morning with urgent news that changed everything about our approach to handling Jake's situation. Your brother and Savannah attempted to board a flight to Mexico City last night, Margaret reported. They were arrested at O'Hare Airport after federal agents discovered that Jake was traveling with falsified identification documents and over $40,000 in cash that couldn't be properly accounted for. The attempted flight to Mexico represented Jake's plan to disappear permanently before his various criminal activities could be fully investigated by law enforcement. Margaret explained that Jake's arrest had been precipitated by an investigation that had been running parallel to her own private inquiry. The FBI has been tracking Jake's activities for 6 weeks as part of a broader investigation into illegal gambling operations and money laundering in the Chicago area, Margaret continued. Your brother's name appeared in connection with several high-stakes poker games that were suspected of being fronts for organized crime activities. Jake's association with professional gambling rings had brought him to the attention of federal investigators who had been monitoring communications and financial transactions related to illegal casino operations. His attempted departure from the country with large amounts of cash had triggered automatic alerts that resulted in his detention and arrest. Savannah was arrested on separate charges related to identity theft and fraud that are connected to her previous criminal activities, Margaret explained. The charges against your brother include theft, fraud, money laundering, and attempted flight from prosecution. Within hours of Jake's arrest, I received phone calls from family members who had been completely shocked by news reports about his detention and the federal charges that had been filed against him. David, my cousin, who was an attorney, called first to express his complete bewilderment about the situation and to apologize for his previous criticism of my refusal to provide Jake with money. Aline, I owe you a massive apology, David said, his voice filled with shame and regret. I completely misjudged the situation, and I'm horrified that I criticized you for refusing to enable what was obviously criminal behavior. David explained that he had been contacted by federal investigators who were seeking information about Jake's financial activities and his attempts to manipulate family members into providing money for his schemes. The FBI agent I spoke with said that your refusal to give Jake $50,000 probably prevented him from using that money to finance even more serious criminal activities, David continued. They believe he was planning to use large amounts of cash to invest in drug trafficking operations that would have generated enough profit to pay off all his debts while establishing him as a major criminal figure. The revelation that my decision to demand verification of Jake's loan shark story had potentially prevented him from becoming involved in drug trafficking operations provided validation for my instincts about his deception, but it also highlighted how dangerous his criminal trajectory had become. Nancy called next, completely devastated by the news of Jake's arrest and the federal charges that had been filed against him. Aline, I'm so sorry for everything we put you through, Nancy said through tears. We should have listened to your concerns instead of pressuring you to support Jake's lies. We enabled his criminal behavior because we couldn't accept the truth about who he had become. Nancy explained that federal agents had visited their house to interview them about Jake's financial activities and to inform them about the charges related to his theft from our grandmother's bank account and Robert's auto repair shop. They told us that Jake's theft from Grandma Rose constitutes elder abuse and could result in additional felony charges, Nancy continued. We had no idea that the money you were giving Jake was being used to fund criminal activities that victimized our own mother. Robert's reaction to Jake's arrest was more focused on anger and betrayal than grief and regret. Biz, Jake destroyed our family's trust and financial security to fund his criminal activities, Robert told me during a separate conversation. He was willing to let us lose our house and let his grandmother go without medication so he could continue gambling and stealing from everyone who cared about him. The confrontation with Jake himself finally occurred 3 days later when he was released on bail and immediately came to my apartment to attempt one final manipulation of my emotions and financial resources. Aline, you have to help me, Jake pleaded when I reluctantly agreed to meet with him in the lobby of my building under the supervision of building security. The federal charges are all based on misunderstandings and technical violations. I can beat this case if I have enough money to hire a good lawyer. Jake's appearance had deteriorated dramatically during his brief incarceration. He looked thin and desperate, and his usual charm and confidence had been replaced by obvious panic and fear about his legal situation. Everything I did was because of my gambling addiction. Jake continued attempting to revive his previous narrative about being a victim of his own mental health issues. I never intended to hurt anyone, and I was planning to pay back everyone I borrowed money from once my gambling strategy started generating consistent profits. However, my response was informed by months of manipulation and 3 years of financial exploitation that had finally been exposed as part of a comprehensive criminal enterprise. Jake, you stole from our 92-year-old grandmother while she was skipping heart medication because she couldn't afford her prescriptions, I said firmly. You ran a fraud scheme that victimized your friends, and you were planning to fake your death to avoid responsibility for your crimes. Those aren't the actions of someone struggling with addiction. They're the actions of a career criminal who targets his own family. Jake's facade of remorse immediately crumbled when he realized that I had complete knowledge of his criminal activities and would not be manipulated into providing additional financial support. You destroyed my life with your paranoid investigation, Jake said, his voice filled with genuine hatred. If you had just given me the money I needed, none of this would have happened. Everything that happens to Emma and Tyler is your fault because you chose to be selfish instead of helping your family. The conversation ended with Jake threatening to claim that I had been complicit in his criminal activities and that my financial support had enabled his illegal behavior. I'll make sure everyone knows that you were my partner in everything I did, Jake said as building security escorted him from the premises. You gave me money knowing I was gambling with it, and you're just as guilty as I am for everything that went wrong. However, Jake's threats no longer had any emotional impact on me because I finally understood that he was a manipulative criminal who was willing to destroy anyone, including his own children, to avoid accountability for his actions. The final confrontation confirmed that Jake had never been a victim of gambling addiction, who needed family support to overcome his problems. He had been a career criminal who specialized in exploiting family relationships to fund increasingly serious illegal activities that had culminated in federal charges and potential prison time. The legal proceedings against Jake moved forward with surprising speed as federal prosecutors built their case using evidence from both the FBI's investigation and Margaret Torres's private inquiry. Within 2 months of his arrest, Jake had been formally charged with 12 felony counts, including fraud theft, money laundering, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit organized crime. Jake's attorney, a public defender named Thomas Rodriguez, quickly recognized that the evidence against his client was overwhelming and began negotiating a plea agreement that would allow Jake to avoid a lengthy trial in exchange for accepting responsibility for his crimes and providing cooperation with ongoing investigations into illegal gambling operations. Your brother's best option is to plead guilty to the major charges and hope for reduced sentencing based on his cooperation with federal investigators. Rodriguez explained during a meeting with our family. A trial would almost certainly result in maximum sentences for all charges, which could mean 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The plea negotiations revealed additional details about the scope of Jake's criminal activities that even Margaret's investigation hadn't uncovered. Federal agents had discovered that Jake had been involved in money laundering operations that processed over $300,000 in illegal gambling proceeds during the previous 8 months. Jake's role in the organization was to recruit investors and provide legitimate cover for moving large amounts of cash between different illegal gambling operations. The lead FBI agent explained during a victim impact meeting with our family. His schemes, targeting family members and friends, provided a steady source of clean money that could be mixed with illegal gambling profits to make them appear legitimate. Savannah received a separate sentence of 4 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to charges related to identity theft fraud and her role in the money laundering operation. Her cooperation with investigators revealed that she had been running similar schemes in 3 other states and had victimized over 40 people during the previous 2 years. Savannah specialized in identifying vulnerable men with gambling problems and teaching them techniques for manipulating their families and friends. Prosecutors explained, Jake was one of several people she was mentoring in criminal activities designed to generate capital for illegal gambling and drug trafficking operations. The court's restitution orders provided some measure of financial justice for Jake's victims, though the amounts were far less than the total damages he had caused. Christopher Walsh and other investment fraud victims were awarded partial repayment from assets seized during Jake's arrest, but most of the money Jake had stolen had been lost through gambling and would never be recovered. Our family's financial situation began to stabilize when the court ordered immediate restitution for the money Jake had stolen from Grandma Rose's account and the tools and equipment he had taken from Robert's auto repair shop. The restitution payments, combined with the temporary halt of foreclosure proceedings against our parents' house, provided breathing room for our family to begin rebuilding their financial security. The court's recognition that Jake victimized his own family members provides a legal foundation for recovering some of our losses. David explained during a family meeting to discuss the financial implications of the case. While we'll never get back everything we lost, the restitution orders give us priority status for any money that can be recovered from Jake's criminal activities. More importantly, the federal investigation exposed Jake's fake death scheme, which included detailed plans for abandoning Emma and Tyler permanently while collecting life insurance benefits that would have been paid to our parents. Your brother had researched methods for staging his death in what would appear to be a gambling-related murder. Investigators revealed he was planning to disappear to Mexico with a new identity while allowing his children to believe their father had been killed by loan sharks. This revelation finally convinced even Jake's most sympathetic family members that he represented a genuine danger to everyone who had trusted him, and that his criminal behavior extended far beyond addiction-related poor judgment. Nancy's relationship with Jake effectively ended when she learned about his willingness to psychologically traumatize Emma and Tyler by faking his death for his own benefit. I can't forgive Jake for planning to hurt those innocent children to protect himself, Nancy said during one of our conversations about the case. Whatever gambling addiction he may have had doesn't excuse his willingness to destroy his own children's lives for money. Maria successfully petitioned the family court to terminate Jake's parental rights based on the federal criminal charges and evidence of his plans to abandon the children permanently. Emma and Tyler would be protected from further manipulation and trauma while Jake served his prison sentence. The children deserve to grow up without the constant threat of their father's criminal activities affecting their lives, Maria explained. Jake lost the right to be their father when he chose crime over their well-being. Extended family members who had been turned against me by Jake's manipulation campaign began reaching out with apologies and expressions of regret about their treatment of me during the crisis. Aunt Patricia called to apologize for her harsh criticism and to express admiration for my persistence in uncovering the truth about Jake's criminal activities. "You saved our family from even worse damage by refusing to be manipulated," Patricia said. "If you had given Jake that $50,000, he would have used it to fund drug trafficking operations that could have destroyed all of our lives." Uncle Thomas and Cousin Sarah sent similar messages, acknowledging that my refusal to enable Jake's behavior had been the correct decision and expressing gratitude for my willingness to expose his crimes despite the personal cost of family conflict. The federal investigation also revealed that Jake's edited recording of our conversation about the loan shark threats was being used as evidence of his sophisticated manipulation techniques, rather than proof of my supposed heartlessness. "Your brother's recording demonstrates his calculated approach to exploiting family emotions for criminal gain," prosecutors explained. "The fact that he planned and recorded that conversation shows premeditation and criminal intent rather than addiction-related desperation." Jake's sentencing hearing took place 6 months after his arrest, with family members providing victim impact statements that describe the emotional and financial damage his criminal activities had caused. Jake betrayed the trust of every person who loved him and used our family relationships as weapons to fund his criminal enterprise, Nancy told the court during her statement. "His actions damaged our family's financial security and emotional well-being in ways that will take years to repair." The judge sentenced Jake to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and his cooperation with ongoing investigations into organized criminal activities. Mr. Morrison's crimes represent a systematic exploitation of family relationships and a calculated effort to victimize the people who cared about him most, the judge stated during sentencing. While his gambling addiction may have been a contributing factor to his initial criminal behavior, the evidence shows that he evolved into a career criminal who was willing to harm his own children to avoid accountability for his actions. 6 months after Jake's sentencing, I found myself sitting in a small conference room at the Chicago Community Center, looking around at the faces of 12 other people who had experienced the devastating impact of a family member's gambling addiction and associated criminal behavior. What had started as my own healing journey had evolved into something far more meaningful and transformative. "Welcome, everyone, to our weekly meeting of Families Against Gambling Exploitation," I said, opening our support group session. "For newcomers, I want you to know that you're not alone in dealing with the manipulation, lies, and criminal behavior that often accompany severe gambling addiction." The support group had grown organically from conversations I'd had with other victims of Jake's crimes during the court proceedings. Christopher Walsh, who had lost $15,000 to Jake's investment fraud scheme, had connected me with several other families who had experienced similar betrayals by relatives with gambling addictions. The thing that helped me the most was realizing that saying no to my brother's demands wasn't cruel or heartless. I continued sharing my experience with the group. It was actually the most loving thing I could do because continuing to enable his behavior would have funded even more serious crimes that could have destroyed our entire family. Nancy had become an active member of the support group, attending meetings regularly and sharing her own journey from enabler to advocate for accountability and tough love approaches to addiction recovery. I spent 3 years making excuses for Jake's behavior and providing him with money that funded his criminal activities, Nancy told the group during one particularly emotional session. "I thought I was being a good mother by supporting him unconditionally, but I was actually helping him hurt other people and avoid getting the real help he needed." Robert's participation in the group had been more limited, but he had found value in connecting with other fathers who had struggled with similar feelings of guilt and responsibility for their adult children's destructive choices. It's hard to accept that love sometimes means letting someone face the consequences of their actions, Robert shared during one of his visits to the group, but continuing to rescue Jake from his problems would have prevented him from ever learning to take responsibility for his life. The financial recovery for our family had been slower than the emotional healing, but steady progress was being made on multiple fronts. The court-ordered restitution payments had allowed our parents to catch up on their mortgage payments and avoid foreclosure, though they would be dealing with debt from Jake's exploitation for several more years. Grandma Rose's bank account had been restored through the restitution process, and she was finally able to afford her heart medications without skipping doses. More importantly, she had been moved to a senior living facility where her finances were managed professionally to prevent future exploitation by family members or other criminals. Grandma Rose is actually healthier and happier now than she was before Jake's arrest, Nancy reported during one of our family dinners. The assisted living facility provides social activities and medical support that have improved her quality of life significantly. My relationship with extended family members had been fully restored, with several relatives expressing appreciation for my persistence in uncovering the truth about Jake's criminal activities. David had become a valuable legal resource for the support group, providing guidance about protecting assets and pursuing legal remedies for family members who had been victimized by relatives with gambling addictions. The legal system is starting to recognize that gambling-related financial abuse is a serious crime that deserves the same protections as other forms of domestic violence, David explained during one of his presentations to our support group. Mariah had remarried and was successfully co-parenting Emma and Tyler with her new husband, providing the children with stability and security they had never experienced during their father's involvement in their lives. The children had received counseling to help them process their father's criminal behavior and understand that his choices were not their responsibility. Emma and Tyler are thriving now that they're not constantly worried about their father's unpredictable behavior and financial crises, Maria reported during a family gathering. They're able to be normal children who focus on school and friendships instead of trying to manage adult problems. The children had not had contact with Jake since his arrest, and Maria had decided that any future relationship would depend on Jake's ability to demonstrate genuine change and stable behavior after completing his prison sentence and probation period. My own career had benefited from the crisis management skills I had developed during the ordeal with Jake. My employer had promoted me to senior marketing director after recognizing my ability to handle complex family situations while maintaining professional performance under extreme stress. Going through this experience taught me how to set boundaries and make difficult decisions based on evidence rather than emotions. I reflected during my annual performance review. Those skills have been invaluable in managing challenging client relationships and complex marketing campaigns. More significantly, I had developed a deeper understanding of my own values and priorities that had led to more authentic relationships with friends and romantic partners who appreciated my commitment to honesty and accountability. The private investigation firm that Margaret Torres worked for had offered me a part-time consulting position, helping other families navigate similar crises involving financial exploitation by relatives. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful, as I was able to use my experience to help others avoid the mistakes our family had made in enabling destructive behavior. Each family situation is unique, but the patterns of manipulation and exploitation are remarkably consistent. I observed during a presentation at a conference about financial crimes against family members. Learning to recognize these patterns early can prevent years of financial and emotional damage. The most profound change in my life had been developing a clear understanding of the difference between supporting someone you love and enabling their destructive behavior. The crisis with Jake had taught me that genuine love sometimes requires saying no and allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. Recovery from any addiction requires the person to take responsibility for their actions and make different choices, I shared with support group members. As family members, we can offer emotional support for recovery efforts, but we can't love someone into sobriety or criminal rehabilitation. As our support group session concluded that evening, I felt grateful for the journey that had led me from victim to advocate. Jake's criminal behavior had caused tremendous pain and financial hardship for our family, but it had also taught us valuable lessons about boundaries, accountability, and the true meaning of unconditional love. Before we close tonight, I want to remind everyone that protecting yourself and your family from exploitation isn't selfish or cruel, I said to the group. It's actually an act of love that creates the opportunity for genuine healing and growth. A new member of the group, a woman named Patricia, whose son had been stealing money to fund his gambling addiction, approached me after the meeting to express gratitude for sharing my experience. Your story gives me hope that I can survive this crisis and that saying no to my son's demands might actually help him in the long run, Patricia said through tears. You absolutely can survive this, I assured her. The most important thing to remember is that you didn't cause your son's addiction. You can't control his choices and you can't cure his problems. But you can protect yourself and create healthy boundaries that support genuine recovery if he chooses to pursue it. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how much my life had changed since the day I first agreed to help Jake get back on his feet after his divorce. The young woman who had eagerly provided money to support her brother's supposed landscaping business had evolved into someone who understood that genuine help sometimes looks like refusal, and that saying no can be the most loving response to destructive behavior. The foreclosure notice that had started this nightmare had ultimately become the catalyst for our family's recovery and growth. By refusing to continue enabling Jake's criminal behavior, I had saved our family from even greater devastation, while creating the opportunity for genuine healing and authentic relationships built on honesty rather than manipulation. Most importantly, I had learned that being called stingy by people who wanted to exploit my generosity was actually a sign that I was making healthy choices that protected my values and my future. The reality that Jake, Nancy, and Robert couldn't ignore was that unconditional financial support had enabled criminal behavior that hurt everyone involved, while loving accountability had created the foundation for genuine recovery and family healing. Jake would serve his prison sentence and hopefully use the time to address his gambling addiction and criminal thinking patterns. Whether he chose to pursue genuine recovery would be his decision, but our family would never again enable destructive behavior in the name of love or loyalty. The experience had taught me that saying no to unreasonable demands wasn't a character flaw. It was an act of wisdom and courage that protected not only my own well-being, but also created the opportunity for others to take responsibility for their choices and find genuine solutions to their problems. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family pressure made you question your own judgment about what was right? Sometimes, the hardest thing about setting boundaries with people we love is dealing with the guilt and criticism that comes from others who think we should keep giving without limits. I'd love to hear your thoughts about when it's appropriate to say no to family members who keep asking for help, and how you've handled situations where standing firm created conflict with people you care about. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about family relationships, personal growth, and finding the courage to make difficult but necessary decisions. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. Sometimes knowing that others have faced these challenges can provide the strength needed to make healthy choices. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you recognize that protecting yourself and setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's actually one of the most loving things you can do for everyone involved.